All right, I jumped right in because I want to have so much fun with this. I'm not going to have to do anything because we have two powerhouses that are going to come in here and talk to us about, and let me remove myself so you can see, breaking barriers, building trust. Two of the most incredible speakers with the stories, with the experience, the scars, the bruises that are probably still visible now. So I would love to introduce you Tania Lucky and Karina Clever, two of the best last names to have ever. So we are literally lucky and clever to have you on. Um, I'm going to go off stage. Both of you are, to me, the center of excellence when it comes to the topics that you're about to bring to the table. And I don't need to say a damn thing because I know you two and I appreciate you two. And I'm going to let you go. So I'll see you in about 45 to 50 minutes.
Thank you, Mel.
See you later. Welcome, everyone. While Nia pulls up her amazing presentation, we can kind of look at the title that we have. Go ahead, Nia, kick us off.
No, outstanding. So good evening, good afternoon, everyone. For those of you in California, it's evening where I'm at here in North Carolina. Mel wasn't wrong. We have a power-packed hour with you guys tonight. And we're going to be talking about a little bit about AppSec compliance and what it takes to break some of those common barriers to build the trust that's needed for real success in cyber risk quantification and implementation and kind of enforcement of governance, risk, and compliance. So high-level overview, there's a little bit of an idea. So we'll go through our introductions. We're going to talk to you about why AppSec needs PRQ and GRC, share a little bit of cheat sheets and frameworks with all of you to break it down and make it less complex, go through a little bit of a practical application case study, and then take it away with some summary and next steps along with some closing remarks. But before we dive in, let's go ahead and introduce ourselves. So I'm Nia Lucky. I am a cybersecurity professional with a strong background in audit compliance, along with controls analytics, and just being an overall well-rounded risk manager. I've worked both in the public and private sectors, supporting accreditations, spanning Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and the intelligence agency, with my highest accreditation being a FedRAMP IL5 approval for a new SaaS offering. I do, like I said, specialize in GRC and risk management with over 15 years experience. I've worked specializing in framework design tailored to client needs, incident response, and just risk management practices in program and project delivery. I am a public speaker and a published author. So I was able to co-author the CISO playbook that's offered and out there for open order alongside Andres, who, again, another visionary and just excellent leader in the space of cybersecurity and what it really makes and takes to be a leader in today's industry. So we kind of talk through real life experiences in that book. And share some of our best practices and tricks of the trade that we've come across that really help you succeed in positions like that. And looking towards the future, I really like to align myself with clients' unique needs to do exactly this, have conversations that drive kind of changes in the way we look at risk and compliance and what it takes, and turn it into less of a check the box exercise. And that's where I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Karina, and she's going to go ahead and talk through how amazing she is.
Did we hear somebody say checkbox compliance? No.
We might have.
No. So look, folks, so I'm Karina Clever. I am the founder and CEO of Clever Compliance. We have an amazing staff full of just brilliant humans who help to kind of bring that glue for our clients between the ethereal regulatory and framework requirements that are written very nebulously and broadly, so that they kind of apply to anybody and everybody, and kind of execute on defining the controls that exist inside actual operations, so that controls can be put in place to actually manage GRC across the entirety of the company. One important thing to kind of remind yourself of every time you're kind of in doubt and you want to do checkbox compliance and follow a 78,000 row spreadsheet that doesn't say much of anything, and bring in 50 people to spin for several years, go over to the HHS OCR breach portal. I just went on yesterday, and I think more than 70% of all Americans, over 250 million people, have actually been involved in some sort of a PHI breach. These are only actively open cases. This is not closed. This is not in the past. This is open right now, right? I've been doing this since April 1989, kind of grew up old school with the punch cards and the tape mounts, and started doing GRC in 2002. So bring a little bit of experience to the table here across different industries. We are a leader in compliance management as a service. For those of you who do not want to bring in a full-time GRC person, or you don't have the work to bring somebody in full-time, we could definitely help with that need. That's all I have, Nia. Thanks.
Well, I think between the two of us and our talents, we'll be able to tackle AppSec compliance here in the next 30 to 45 minutes, Karina.
Yeah.
So let's go ahead and dive in. So what brings us here today? And it's really a conversation about actions that have been coming our direction out of the federal spaces. So specifically, we're talking about SEC enforcement actions. So in the last year alone, we've watched the SEC start enforcing some fines and really penalties that have been disclosed for non-compliance as it relates to disclosing critical breaches. So our first primary example is a little bit of what happened in 2020 with the SolarWinds breach, right? It wasn't a secret across industry, was it? Well, it wasn't until last year that really the SEC was able to pin down, right, some fine and quantify the cost of the risks that were associated with the breaches. And here on this slide, it just really highlights the confusion that a lot of teams and stakeholders experience, not only when they have a breach, but when they have to report that breach, right? So there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of where do we even look, what data points do we need to volley up so that it provides the most value, and we're able to talk through how we're going to remediate that. This is occurring in businesses today, and today's kind of walk away would be a strong understanding of what data points you want to look for as it relates to your applications, their security, and quantifying risk over time. And Karina, would you want to add anything to that?
So the one thing I'm going to add to this is please drill, right? So a lot of us have forgotten those DRBCP plans. We think that they're in some folder. We think they're sitting on a shelf collecting dust. We need to make sure that we use code words so that the flow of work from an alert to the incident, to the escalation, to legal, to HR, to the vendor. I'm throwing out departments. It could be different departments in your specific organization. That flow of work needs to be defined for your company specifically, because if you don't satisfy the 4-day requirement, you're going to get yourself into a bigger heap of trouble. Now, something really quick to consider is a lot of the folks that are the technicians that are unfortunately sitting on those swivel chairs in the cybersecurity space and the incident management space, and they're burning out because we've put too many tools in front of them, right? So that's kind of a separate conversation. But those guys, many of them and girls, want to do the right thing. They want to restore the system. They want to isolate the problem. Many of them know that if you drop something into legal, it's 45 days later. So they're picking up the phone and they're calling the Securities Exchange Commission themselves. And they're protected by whistleblower laws. So unless you go through and drill in your company all of the departments that are involved inside that SEC filing and have that drill complete within 4 days, please expect that there may be some negative repercussions, because that whistleblower is actually initiating a call from the SEC, because now they're going to come in and say, well, wait a minute, why didn't you have that filed to us with 4 days? There must be something wrong with your incident response plan.
No, exactly.
So make sure that you're checking on that very carefully.
And I think a big part of it, honestly, is just understanding the disconnect, right? So I think we can all agree that within the teams we support and the lines of business that we kind of feed into, right, we have our application security focus. And this is typically team-centric, where we prioritize technical security controls and really concentrating on closing those vulnerability gaps, right, that are disclosed in our vulnerability scanning, which are different than our GRC objectives, right, which really focuses on the broader organizational risk, and they ensure compliance with those regulations and those policies that Karina was just mentioning. And what we're seeing over time is that there's a drastic communication gap between each level within your organization all the way down to the team level. And so this conversation is really a proposed solution of, let's help you develop cyber risk quantification for the applications you work on at the team level, alongside your directors and your management teams, right? And then let's have a broader understanding of what your company's GRC framework is. And let's break that RACI down, and let's ensure that our policies, our procedures, our post-breach activity cleanup is reviewing those to see if we have any areas of improvement that could help prevent something like this in the future, especially with that, mean time to detect and that mean time to recover. Karina, any insights on this one?
So I'm going to highlight the communication gap, and I think I'm still a little shell-shocked from the LA wildfires. Create the templates while you can before there's an emergency, so that you have your internal communications, external communications. Your internal communications may even break out per role. Assumption here is all of your folks have been trained on your DRBCP plan. External communications are going to also break out per vendor potentially, per media, for insurances, for 4-letter, 3-letter agencies. So you need to make sure that you've developed some sort of consistent template to use, because when an emergency is happening, that's the last thing you want to be thinking about, because it's going to be all over the place. No one's trained. And then it causes an additional stress to the already panicky situation. We live in silos somehow or other along the way. We're not sure how. That compliance and that GRC group got completely isolated. The reality is IT and all of the competencies within IT, incident, change management, problem management, vulnerability management, patch management, maintenance, all of it. Your scanning, all of it. Your access controls, all those things, all those IT competencies actually feed into overall GRC and being able to show the governance of that. And so we have to all actively go back to our offices and say, how do I reduce some of the silos that we're seeing in our environments? And kind of referencing this slide as a model for that.
No, absolutely. And why? So the why about this whole conversation is, well, there's a required form that we have to fill out, mandatory disclosure, that reports significant events to the SEC. And so we're not talking about your lower level events or even incidents, but we are talking about, if we're looking at it from a criticality lens, anything that would be critical or significant, right? Especially a breach where there's been exfiltration. And we have to be able to quantify the size of that breach to the SEC. Why? Because overall, it comes down to investor protection at the end of the day, right? Filing or delaying the filing of an 8K can actually lead to investigations, additional penalties on top, and reputational damage that, honestly, in some cases, you may not be able to recover from. Especially if you are a mid-sized to like smaller sized organization, a breach like this, along with disclosure, could cripple your ability to continue operating. And overall, honestly, I'm here for it. I'm here for the forum. I'm here for the disclosure. Why? Because it helps bolster transparent visibility into what your risks are, but in a way that helps drive conversations on where our shareholder and investor dollars need to go to help bolster security, right? Instead of an afterthought. Karina, any insights on the Form 8K or making it through that type of exercise?
And I think this this is a culmination of that drill, right? So if that unfortunate event ever happens, because you've now drilled it, because you've exercised it across all of your departments, you can now produce and file a very thorough 8K. And you want to do now. I can actually hear my attorney friends kind of from the opposite side of my imaginary room going, no, it's material weakness. We're just going to make sure to decline as much as we can of any accountability and say that this isn't, this wasn't material, so we don't have to disclose it. And there are a lot of people who are taking that position. I really, really warn against it, because at the end of the day, you're still required, if you're publicly traded, to actually have that incident management plan in place. So if you deem an event non-material weakness related and decide that you will not file an 8K, make sure that your incident response plan includes that calculation that said, we had an event, but we determined based on these criteria that we are not filing, because that is a document you might want to be showing to the SEC regulator if they come knock on your door. Just a heads up, folks.
And it might be, a little bit of what SolarWinds faced, right? And so there may have been delays in that case. Again, it's a use case. You guys can do some public research on that. But in the end, there were fines and there were penalties. So doing that drilling on the front end is really just a discipline and a practice that is, really beneficial to build into your team's resilience, because that's what we're talking about. What is your ability to recover, and how fast can you have a conversation about it? So I think we broke this down pretty well. So the SEC has a 96-hour rule that's basically saying from time of incident or event to time of disclosure, 96 hours. And it does. You want to talk through discovery, assessment, and that reporting during that 8K filing. So this is where a strong understanding what AppSec compliance really is. And AppSec compliance really, again, focuses on security standards to safeguard those applications from internal and external threats, right? Ensuring secure software development. So I know some of us on the call, or, just even in our profession, we've heard of the software development life cycles, for example. So it's really bringing in how your application development goes through that journey and how it ties into continuous monitoring and improvement, right? Really highlighting and showcasing an importance for security measures and accounting for the really critical ones that come in by way of those DAS, SAST, or internal vulnerability scans, right? So that we can comply with regulatory standards that are external from us. So why quantify the risk? Well, other than bridging the communication gap that we know is critical for getting through an 8K SEC filing exercise, right? It also helps us develop professionally how we communicate gaps or, maybe not so popular observations through metrics, So sometimes, right, words, depending on what you use to describe an event or an incident, could be triggering and cause panic, where honestly, we need to be more pragmatic about it. So it brings you down to a point of quantification to drive a more purposeful conversation that allows for informed decisions to be made based on the data. And then that way you can be strategically aligned to what remediation is going to look like, right? What the vector was. So when you go through your root cause analysis exercise, as you're working through that remediation, you're sharing common objectives across the layers of leadership. So remember, going back a couple of minutes now, we were discussing there is a large gap from executive leadership down to those application teams that are handling the active remediation. And we need to be aligned with a purpose that says, hey, we have common objectives. We want to see you succeed as a team in developing and making that application stronger. So what do you need from us at the executive levels to help do that? So a lot of times the information and the data that comes up from the teams, if we're able to point it to a metric and we're able to show improvement over time or reduction of risk over time, we're taking steps in the right direction. So what is the real challenge here? Honestly, for me, I think it does come down to a little bit of complex math and trying to figure out what math to really use. And there are different metric points that can help drive that. And oftentimes there's more than one framework that can help us get there too. And then each one needs its own business translation, like I just talked through a little bit. But Karina, in your experience, when it comes to really quantifying risk as it relates to significant breaches, while stress is high, what challenges are you seeing?
So I think really this slide nails it, right? You have compliance team that come in and report on ethereal controls that don't even apply to your operations. Many of the risk statements are not based on real operations. So our disjointment seems to happen when we have on one side of the house teams of people who try to come up with charts and graphs and statuses that really are not reflective of the real operations that we have in our IT environments. And I mean, to me, GRC is that glue, right? So I can say, hey, I have a DR plan. How ready are we? And we're satisfying all of these regulations and frameworks along the way. And when we drill it and we do that tabletop, we can actually measure how successful we are against the numbers that we have targeted. We're not to try to create actual reports and metrics based on irrelevant controls is really our biggest danger, which is why we keep going into this spin. And, Mia's proposing a few frameworks that we're going to be looking at further in this presentation. And they're all saying, these are generalized frameworks. You have to appropriate this to your actual environment. And so not only does the board not know what to ask for, but the IT teams are kind of stuck with trying to come up with metrics and dashboards based on the tools or the vendors that they have at their disposal. Sometimes they're even contradictory. Either which way, it's not a common accepted language that is actually approved and decided on in the entire company. It really is this stressful, like this guy in this picture is. Man.
I can only imagine. So honestly, what's the first cheat sheet that comes to mind? Well, for me, I think pulling from a solid governance, risk, and compliance framework, that's where you would want to start, right? We want to look at how we establish clear policies, standards, and accountability structures for application security risk. And if it's not defined, let's get it defined in a policy and procedures that can be implemented down at the team levels. And the same goes for your risk management practices. Develop those systematic, repeatable approaches to identify, assess, and prioritize security risk, right? To Karina's point, it shouldn't always be a little bit of an exercise or a competition or check the block on, yep, we did these 10 activities, we've done risk management. No, develop those approaches, make them tailor fit to your team's need, and have those metrics defined that are rooted in data that is repeatable, that you can report on, and then tie that into that compliance adherence, right? To those, not just the internal policies, but now we start looking external at regulators and the needs to comply across all areas. So sometimes it, might have an NYDFS focus, or it can have a NIST focus, but come to some form of concurrence on the regulations that you are required to adhere to, and then really start looking into your policies and procedures on how to apply that. And within those policies and procedures, start calling out your metric points of measurement. So your mean time to recover, your mean time to detect, your mean time to respond. Those are 3 critical metric points that a lot of teams, especially application security teams, may have a hard time getting down to a point of measure.
So I want to really quickly recommend that one of the first documents that is published is your governance document. We all forget about that. How much of a presence does governance have in your environment? Your second one should be your document policy, including how do I get exceptions? How do I submit feedback, specifying the ownership? And both of those should also have metrics in them as they're being written. And inside your governance document, you're going to be identifying the critical regulations and frameworks that your specific company has to abide by. And that's where that's going to become very important.
No, agree. And the reason why I agree so much with that statement is because this is where we start layering in other techniques, other frameworks that really are rooted in the whole spirit of risk quantification, right? So FAIR helps organizations comprehend not just the nature of their information risk, but how to really quantify it and utilize structured risk assessments for moment in time breach attacks, right? Because that's what we're talking about is an event or an incident happened. How do we measure and quantify everything that happened to and include possible forecasts for reputational damage, right? Or engineering hours and billables that are going to be required for that remediation post-breach or post-breach cleanup. But ultimately, what FAIR is based in, and the reason why I like leveraging it as a methodology and a framework, is to build that stakeholder confidence, right? And they also have a tool. We'll get to it a little bit later in the presentation, but they have a free for use tool that can help you really lean in on quantifying that risk to reduce the risk profile over time and ensure compliance with relevant regulations like the SEC 96-hour rule. Right. And it helps us demonstrate these, concepts known as due care and due diligence, not just to our stakeholders and our regulators, but internally to each other. We're showing a development and a growth in discipline as it relates to risk measurement and really taking accountability for what we're there to do for a business. Right. What a greater way to drive impact and value than really leaning in on how to showcase the security of the application you're developing is the way I like to frame it. Anything you would add on this one, Karina?
Oh, go for it. Keep going. Let's get through these 3 big ones.
Right. And then the next up right behind this is a tool I came across while working at Cisco. So this is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. Again, there's free access. So just research. But what I love about this is you can take the application you're looking at and use a standardized rating model. And that's based on a numeric scoring system. So we're looking at an application and we're looking at the impact scorecard of an identified vulnerability. And they also give you tiering rating, like, so the level of criticality, the higher the score, the higher the criticality, right? So it helps drive decisions in relation to how fast we have to remediate when breaches happen, or even before breaches happen, when vulnerabilities are identified. Leveraging and bringing in the CVSS scoring is a powerful way to stay on top of how to prioritize which vulnerabilities get remediated over time. And right behind that, especially when we're talking about AppSec and AppSec compliance, I recommend OWASP SAM for our lovely open source applications. Why? Because this is a bit of a heat map as it relates to maturity modeling, right? So you're able to look at things like defect management. You're able to look at things like secure architecture, which may be external function to your purpose within the team that you support, right? Along with what Karina hit on, incident management. How well are we monitoring that open source application, right, within the current tooling? And does the SOC have the full visibility that it needs in order to timely detect, timely respond, and timely remediate?
So on this one, I do want to add that this is I believe a 300 some page document that prompts you with questions for pretty much each of the boxes that you see on the screen, right? So this is something that will challenge you to answer and define your own maturity. So you might need to go back and say, oh, wait, we don't have this consideration that I'm being prompted for in this questionnaire. And you go write that, and then you come back to it. But again, deciding on one or a combination of all of these for your particular company is really what's going to baseline that continuity between the IT groups who are extremely effective and those compliance groups who are displaying and showing off that adherence, that risk posturing, and the maturity and the continual improvement planning.
No, that's exactly right. And I think honestly, what it's about is layering these three techniques at the end of the day. So you have a maturity model, you have a scoring methodology, and you have another methodology that's going to help you develop those key risk indicators, right, to quantify that overall risk for your organization in a hybrid type of format. And so then when it all comes together, what you're really looking at is an integrated proprietary framework for your business, right? So you have strategic decision making at the very top. That's really bolstered, and the foundation deals with the CVSS scoring, the OWASP maturity assessment, and the financial impact modeling that comes out of your FAIR analysis, right? And it builds upon the technical foundations to lead up to that strategic decision making when it comes to these, application security as a whole, but also when it comes to these moment in time events or incidents. Because at the end of the day, it's about quantifying financial exposure, right? So kind of going back and just a little bit of a reminder, it's about identifying those critical assets, right? Assessing those threats, including active vulnerabilities that are live within your production, and calculating and estimating for that calculated financial loss. Or to consider when you're looking at certain event cases or incident cases. And NIST does a great job of breaking down some of those when you are standing up things like your incident response policy or your incident response plan.
So the one thing I'm going to add to this is know where your golden eggs are, please, because no matter how many of these great, fantastic guidances you have, if you don't know where your most important data is, how are you going to write that incident management plan? You're not going to go, like when we don't have data purposefulness, data minimization, data classification, data mapping out to our vendors, when we don't have those very core basic principles in place and actively working, I can write a document that's 700 pages long.
Right.
What good is that for me when I go protect that asset? I know I'm kind of piggybacking on the slide here. That asset that I want to protect the most, that I want to recover first compared to the other assets, right? The one that I want to encrypt. Why are we encrypting publicly available data? All of us are doing it because it's too hard for people to classify. Do we know where the data is if we have consumer data for underage people? Have we identified that? Do we know that Karina is in the state of California and has a different set of consumer privacy rights compared to Mia and different fulfillment requirements, right? So if we are in the business of selling something to consumers or gathering their data or PCI DSS, we better be able to identify very quickly and isolate those critical data components that actually have support our business. Then we assess what kind of threat could they be under, right? And then we assess if we lose that golden egg. I could lose all the publicly available data that I want. I mean, I should be purging it every 2 weeks. Won't be an impact to my business. So this is the thing that you have to very carefully design and decide as you're establishing this risk quantification framework.
No, that's absolutely correct. And when you are going through your exercise of identifying those critical assets, you need to be asking yourself, is there PHI or PII on this server or on this application, right? We have applications, for example, that have money movement information. Well, that's protected data, right? So I would argue, well, not necessarily argue, but my challenge to the audience is have those conversations, because what you're really looking for is likelihood and then impact, right? Because a golden egg is exactly that. It doesn't matter when it's breached. Once it's breached, if it has all of that information, what's your recovery look like then? And that's kind of how you want to frame it as you're working through this. And then you're able to, that's why calculating the loss is step 3, but it does start with criticality.
Absolutely.
And really, what's the buildup? Well, the buildup, regardless if you end up in an exercise with the SEC having to file an 8K or not, but in all honesty, internal discipline that we can develop all the way around is really by way of a GRC impact report, right? And having these every time we do see an event or an incident triggered, so that we have a regular cadence of internal reporting for our teams, right? It helps prepare for audit readiness, but it also helps in situations like this. And the reason why it helps in situations like this is your points of calculation are already accounted for in a lot of ways. What is your percentage of remediation over time, right? How available does this information need to be to executive leadership for GRC compliance, right? And then what's remaining? I understand recovery takes a lot, and sometimes the remediation timelines, they're kind of long. But it's about really concisely capturing the gaps remaining. What is that true level of effort? What was the level of impact? And then again, impact being defined by dollars spent. So, and that does include time from your engineering staff to extend to account for some of these remediations. But it starts with you had a breach. And remembering every time you hear we have an event, we have an incident, we have a breach, that should trigger in your brain, we need an impact report, right? Start capturing that data timely now. That way, if the significant event or incident happens, this is muscle memory, right? Work with organizations to define what goes into that report and then lean on maybe some of the best practice that's in industry that recommends what data points would be optimal to see in a report like this. And Karina, in your cases, are there examples where this is working really well for any of the clients?
So the mitigation, the knee-jerk reaction needs to be on the mitigating efforts. And the first question the board needs to be asking is, has there been a project manager assigned to the remediation that we have to go through as a result of this? Who is on point? We very rarely ask that question, and we need to account for it because although I can understand whether or not we came out okay out of an incident, what I want to know is, what are we doing to not have something like this happen again, right? Are we upping the training? Are we tightening the perimeter security controls? Are we putting in MDMs? Are we deciding, to change our position on BYOD? Whatever that situation is, we want to make sure that we have actionable steps in place and there's someone accountable or a department accountable to execute on that project plan of remediation items. Because not only have you now at this point identified your own risk, you're now putting in mitigating controls, which every auditor will just hug you for. Because they love to see that you can do self-identification and show steps that you've taken to actually do the mitigating efforts.
No, absolutely. And honestly, when you're doing this, know that you're not alone, especially if you are working in an embedded application team, right? And work with your vendors. Again, it shows an additional step of that due diligence, that continuous monitoring, and those security agreements that we have in place with some of these hosted applications. But also as it relates to third-party impact assurance, right, which ties right back into GRC. So if we go back and we look at the impact report, you would want to account for maybe some of those vendor risk management categories in that reporting as well. But it minimizes the risk of security incidents overall, right? And more importantly, I know we're talking about an SEC filing exercise, but at the end of the day, if you need to be able to demonstrate you have visibility into this because of NYDFS compliance for New York compliance, for example, this is a great way to do that. And you already have the relationships in place and you already have the contracts in place. It's just ensuring that through our contracting language and our agreements with our hosted vendor and applications that we're establishing those clear expectations, right? And we're able to track that vendor performance and security together.
So the one quick thing to add on that is check the contracts.
Yes.
Check to make sure that the SLAs are well defined and that there are success criteria that will help your governance program from your vendors.
No, absolutely. All right, so now we're going to get down to the nitty gritty. This is where, in all honesty, when we were prepping for this webinar, at the end of it, I looked at Karina. I was like, this could really be a walkaway tabletop exercise for anybody that receives this presentation. So starting on the big scary slide, all the way to the end, it walks you through kind of just critical key areas of focus that you could bring to any table to walk through with your teams. So in our scenario, we have a breach. We have a critical vulnerability found on an online banking application. Authentication was bypassed, and they were able to gain unauthorized access to user accounts. That is what we know. A little bit of background on the company. Has global reach, security focus, so it's focused on improving its application security posture. And its framework adoption involves a little bit of what we've talked about today. So they're using FAIR to quantify financial risk. They're using a combination of CVSS scoring through that framework and along with OWASP maturity modeling for their open source applications. But what we haven't spoken about or talked about yet is what tools and resources can you have or should you have at your disposal before going any further? And on the screen in front of you are some of my favorites. So starting with the FairU tool, this is a calculator that will help you run analysis for modeling cyber risk scenarios just like this. Now, used in combination with GRC platforms, my hope would be that, the organizations you support or that you work for have some type of solution in place that isn't, tracking GRC performance on an individual workbook. But more commonly, you can work in MetricStream, you could work RSA Archer, ServiceNow has GRC integration for platforms and monitoring. But going back to Karina was saying earlier, really leveraging that maturity modeling internally and to show where you are at. That is what is agnostic from a tool that you have worked within your teams to develop specific for your company, right? That's like your heartbeat right there. And then everything else augments and supplements what a lot of that data is driving. And then You also have open use to the FAIR Institute and the community resources for knowledge sharing as it relates to KRI development and actual like getting to that point of measurement. So again, you have the breach information, you have the incident information, and now it's about having that conversation with management and agreeing on what tools you're going to use to go ahead and quantify down that risk of what just happened. Karina, are there any favorites that you've used that have been really beneficial?
I'm going to say they're all only as good or as bad as the data you put in there. Back 35 years ago, we used to call it GIGO, and it stood garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you really load up any platform with a bunch of noise, you're going to get a bunch of noise multiplied by X as a return. So really, before you go loading up that platform, any platform that's doing this measurement, make sure that there's that applicability to your company. That really is the most important thing. It always comes back to that.
No, absolutely. Okay. And well, why is this important? Well, when you have the right tools and you have the right data sets and you know where you're looking and you're really filtering through what is good data versus what's that junk data that's kind of noisy, right? You're able to get it down to that point of measurement. So what Sam would help you drive is understanding that the maturity level of that application security development is low, right? Meaning that you have some really manual processes behind the scenes. You're not repeatable yet, but you would work through that maturity model to really understand what could have been done better, where can you enhance, and then you account for that in your remediation roadmap as it speaks to the resilience of your application over time. You have your FAIR analysis that you can pin that down to an annual loss or ALE, as a lot of us have heard in the past, but really get down to that point of measurement that, okay, so for single event, annual event, your expectancy in terms of cost loss would be an estimated 2 million. And a lot of this is aggregate. So and that's because we're looking at, right, a type of vector, right? So SQL injection was found with a base score of an 8.6, making it a critical. So honestly, the more critical your CVSS scoring is, the lower your maturity is, the higher that loss of expectancy should be, or typically comes out to be when you're running these calculations. But I think, honestly, to make it all make sense instead of, in individual reports or in, worksheet analysis, it's coming together and have this hosted in a platform. SharePoint is probably one of my favorites to do this in, but you can have one of these types of risk calculation worksheets for your applications within your teams that you manage on a monthly basis and you keep updated on a regular cadence, right? So that's where we're going to be looking across the application. We're going to be looking across what's identified within the CVSS, and we're going to ensure that we're keeping up with that the SAM factor or the scoring as a whole, and our mitigation kind of efforts that we've put into really bringing the risk of that occurrence happening down low, like to the lowest level we possibly can, understanding that you can't fully remediate or account for all risks. But do it in a way that makes sense for your organization, that also can feed into the internal GRC reporting along with external SEC reporting through an 8K. And the reason I suggest to get this to this level of organization, and to Karina's earlier challenge of drilling really deep, it makes the filing prep for the SEC 8K a lot easier because you already have the data points, right? A lot of the incident details, you're already going to have those fleshed out. You're going to really understand your financial impact once you've made it through this exercise, right? And truly understanding what went wrong. And then you're going to be able to really detail out a tactical remediation plan that is achievable. And so in reality, what we're doing is we're going from calculation to communication, right? So you're taking that moment of chaos, that, critical breach that occurred, and you're able to get executive approval for the funding and the support that you need. You're able to, observe higher remediation rates across some of these. And you might even experience some budget increases along with faster decision making. I think that's probably my favorite, is when you really tie things down to a quantified metric. It does help you make an easier decision. It helps take kind of almost the emotions and a little bit of that gunk data noise out of it, so that you can make faster decisions that bolster security for your organization or your app teams, right? That really need the support in order to be compliant with the regulations that we're asked to adhere to on a daily basis, especially if you're post IPO, right? If you're a publicly traded company, that's why this is important, right? And because it's less of an exercise of, was this material loss versus was this not material loss? And it's more, it is, but this is what we're able to say about it, do about it, and plan for in the future. And so really it comes down to 3 key takeaways and next steps, right? Working towards timely reporting through proactive security and continuous improvement, right? And some of those steps of a continuous improvement are coming up with ways to quantify your risk as it relates to application security. And working within your teams and the tools around you within your organizations to do exactly that, but proactively, not waiting for the breach or the incident to occur. And so here's a little bit of a targeted game plan. So AppSec compliance and risk quantification. Yep, let's get those on your roadmap. Let's decide if we want to utilize methodologies like FAIR, CVSS in combination with OWASP SAM to provide those structured approaches to maturity modeling, to cyber risk quantification, and to key risk indicator development, and start quantifying financial exposure and bridging communication gaps through numbers, through the math, through the data, so that we can implement risk-based AppSec compliance, right, and quantify that risk on a quarterly basis so that our leaders can make decisions faster, and engage stakeholders quicker, right, and so that they understand what we need to monitor and refine over time, continuously enhancing, obviously, our security postures over time. And it really helps us account for these 4 really big pitfalls, right? Analysis paralysis of our DBAs, our project managers, our program managers, right? Framework purity, it helps us understand that in the world of frameworks and compliance, what speaks to your business model, what speaks to the needs of your application teams, and what makes sense for your business strategy and growth. Right? It breaks down data silos because it encourages transparent communication and visibility. We don't want to hide anything, obviously, a breach, right? So it's those kinds.
So I think one of the things I want to add to this one in particular is people freeze when they don't know what's expected of them or what to do next. People freeze when they don't get the guidance, and when they're kind of left to figure it out for themselves. And damn it, you got a brain in your head, so just go work on it. And so a lot of that, again, comes from governance, right? If you've established that glue for how your operations satisfies your governance requirements, now you have a significantly clearer path that's been forged on behalf of everybody in the department, because now they're not going to be stuck wondering. That people love doing stuff. People love feeling like they're useful, they're helpful, they're accomplishing what they need to. People want to get the accolades. People really do wake up in the morning and want to do a good job. a lot of the things that stop them is they just don't know what they're supposed to be doing. And especially with something like this, we want to make sure to provide them that guidance as much as possible.
No, absolutely. And like I said, that's why they made it on the slide. These are a lot of, the feedback that are coming in from the teams I support, and that I've experienced myself. So it's a good way to just drive positive change, right, within your teams and within your organizations, because it's about securing the future together, right? With the ambitious goal of automating security testing, right? Integrating with the automated tooling that provides our vulnerability scanning during development before we go into production, but enhancing and strengthening our security controls that really we're required to adhere to, but making it a little bit easier to obtain. And then overall staying compliant. And honestly, becoming less of an exercise of saying, oh, let's not do that thing. Or let's have the conversation about how we can avoid having to report, right, large, significant critical breaches. And it's not really that overwhelming. Don't try and do it all at once. Obviously not. But for a little bit of a roadmap, you could easily accelerate it over your next 12 months or 24-month journey. But start by taking an inventory of your critical applications and your critical assets and establishing those baseline values. Implement your scoring methodologies and start gathering those initial metrics. Do that for about a quarter to 2 quarters, right? We really want to see those numbers stabilize. And then conduct your maturity assessment, right? Allow that data to come in and become good, reliable data. Right. And then once you have good, reliable data and you've maturity and modeled out your application or your team, depending on if you want to do the applications across a broader team, then layer on your fair modeling would be my recommendation. Right. That way, again, it's showing remediation over time. You're getting buy-in day over day with these approaches. And then by the time you're ready to start defining your key risk indicators, you may have external teams saying, hey, we like and we saw what you did. We want to apply that too.
So the one thing I want to add is GRC never ends. You never arrive, right? But you want to leverage GRC to optimize your operations. So unless you're measuring that risk internally, and unless you have that posture of, hey, report it to me if it's not working. Let's count the exceptions. Let's understand whether this is a significant risk or not for all of those competency areas across all of those departments. Unless you have that umbrella, you will never be able to continually improve or optimize your operations. So that's one. And the second thing is it's an ongoing, legitimate, forever project. It's not really a project. I guess projects have an end date, but it's a permanent, ongoing operational function in your company that will always keep a tab on how well your governance posture really was baselined, how well it's maturing, and how well it's optimizing.
No, that really rings true.
Okay, we're done.
I guess we're done.
We're done. All right. Thank you. Somebody clapped. I'm blushing.
I don't know if we have an ability to do questions, but we are at the end of the presentation. I think I ran right up on time with a lot of that content, but I really hope our audience took something away from that.
I hope so.
I was laughing because we've been kind of feeding in the comments as banners, so there haven't been any questions. But yes, we are right up on time. I wanted to thank you for the very expertly executed presentation, which is now memorialized on LinkedIn and YouTube. We can take extracts. We can create a whole course out of this to continue to educate the SoCal community nationally or internationally. So I want to thank you both for that. And as always, the give back is huge. So, the community appreciates you both for sharing the decades of institutional knowledge, and looking forward to seeing how we can help you. With that, we're going to wrap it up. I just want to leave everybody with a message on the QR codes that are here. But thank you. LinkedIn and our website, become a member. You can get more of the kind of knowledge transfers and information from our monthly meetings, our planned workshops. We may or may not have some very, very exciting other events scheduled. So stay tuned, folks. Thank you both, and I will see you all soon.
Bye, guys.